JRE. They just opened a hidden chamber beneath the Sphinx, and it's worse than we thought. For centuries, the Great Sphinx of Giza has been staring across the Egyptian desert as if it knows something we don't. Its enormous body has survived thousands of years of erosion, burial, restoration, and political upheaval. But beneath that familiar face is a question that refuses to disappear. What is actually underneath the Sphinx? Now, claims about hidden spaces beneath the monument have resurfaced with renewed force. Reports and online discussions describe scans revealing unusual underground cavities, sometimes portraying them as a newly opened chamber buried beneath the Sphinx's paws. The story sounds extraordinary, almost too extraordinary. But when you separate the dramatic headline from the archaeological record, something even more interesting emerges. Because scientists really have detected subsurface anomalies around the Sphinx. And some of them are located exactly where generations of researchers have wondered whether hidden spaces might exist. The problem is that the evidence does not currently establish that archaeologists have opened a giant secret chamber containing ancient records, treasure, or some lost civilization. What it establishes is something more intriguing. There are still things beneath the Sphinx that we do not completely understand. And that is where the story begins. The Great Sphinx isn't simply a statue sitting on top of the Giza Plateau. It was carved directly from the limestone bedrock. Its body and enclosure are therefore part of the geology of the plateau itself. That makes investigating what lies underneath incredibly difficult. You cannot simply remove a few blocks and look inside. You have to understand the rock first. And this is why researchers have repeatedly turned to technologies that can see beneath the surface without destroying the monument. One of the most important investigations came in the early 1990s, when geophysicists Thomas DeBecke and Robert Schoch conducted seismic investigations around the Sphinx enclosure. Their objective was not to hunt for Atlantis. It was considerably more scientific. They wanted to understand the geology beneath the monument, investigate weathering patterns, and search for possible cavities beneath and around the Sphinx. The results were intriguing. Their published study reported a series of cavities on different sides of the Sphinx, including anomalies between the paws. That sentence alone has fueled decades of speculation, because once you hear the words cavity beneath the Sphinx, the imagination immediately races ahead. What could be down there? A tomb? A tunnel? A forgotten temple? A storage chamber? An earlier structure? Or simply a natural void created by the complicated layers of limestone? That last possibility is far less exciting, but scientifically, it has to remain on the table. The Sphinx sits inside a geological environment containing natural fractures, variations in limestone quality, weathering zones, and cavities. A geophysical anomaly does not automatically mean an ancient architect deliberately carved a room. That distinction is absolutely critical. A scanner can tell researchers that something beneath the surface behaves differently from the surrounding material. It cannot automatically tell them what that thing is. Think of an ultrasound. You can see an unusual shape, but you still need additional evidence to determine exactly what you're looking at. The same principle applies underground. And this is where the modern Sphinx mystery becomes much more complicated than the viral version. Because the Sphinx has a long history of underground exploration. Researchers have documented passages and cavities associated with the monument for decades. In a 1994 study, Egyptologists Zahi Hawass and Mark Leaner examined historical reports concerning a passage beneath the Sphinx. Their work traced accounts of an opening near the rear of the monument that had reportedly been exposed during excavations in the 20th century. In other words, the idea of spaces beneath the Sphinx isn't a new internet invention. The ancient monument really does contain unusual subterranean features. But that still doesn't prove the existence of a gigantic hidden chamber. And this is where one of the biggest myths surrounding the Sphinx enters the story. The Hall of Records. For decades, believers in the idea of a lost prehistoric civilization have repeated a story that a massive archive of ancient knowledge lies beneath the Sphinx. The legend is strongly associated with Edgar Cayce, the 20th century American mystic, who claimed that survivors of Atlantis had hidden records beneath the monument. There is no archaeological evidence demonstrating that such an Atlantean archive exists. But the story became incredibly powerful because it attached itself to something real. The Sphinx really does have subsurface anomalies. And that created a dangerous feedback loop. A geophysical anomaly became a chamber. The chamber became a library. The library became the Hall of Records. And eventually the Hall of Records became proof that archaeologists were hiding something. But science doesn't work that way. Every step requires evidence. If a survey identifies a cavity, researchers need to establish its dimensions. If it appears artificial, they need evidence of human construction. If it appears to contain artifacts, those artifacts need to be documented. If someone claims inscriptions exist inside, the inscriptions need to be photographed, analyzed, dated, and independently examined. Until then, the correct word is not discovered. It is anomaly. And that distinction becomes especially important when we look at what modern archaeology has actually accomplished at Giza. The Sphinx has been investigated using photogrammetry, conventional surveying, geological studies, seismic techniques, and extensive archaeological documentation. Mark Lehner's work on the monument included detailed architectural and geoarchaeological investigation, producing models of the Sphinx's condition and its ancient reconstruction. Researchers aren't ignoring the monument. Quite the opposite. The Sphinx is one of the most intensely studied ancient monuments on Earth. And that creates a paradox. The more scientists study it, the more complicated the picture becomes. We know the Sphinx was heavily restored. We know it was repeatedly buried beneath sand. We know its surface has undergone enormous weathering. We know different parts of the monument were carved from limestone layers, with different properties. We know later Egyptians treated the monument as sacred. And we know ancient builders and later restorers modified portions of it. So if a new cavity is identified, the next question isn't simply, what's inside? The question is, when was it created? That could be far more difficult to answer. Imagine discovering a sealed room beneath an ancient cathedral. Finding the room would be exciting. But who built it? Was it part of the original construction? Was it added centuries later? Was it a natural cavity that someone eventually modified? Was it created by looters? Was it connected to drainage? Without context, the room itself doesn't tell you its entire history. The same principle applies to Giza. And the Sphinx has already demonstrated how easy it is for different periods of history to become layered together. The monument is traditionally associated with Pharaoh Khafre and Egypt's 4th dynasty. Roughly the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. The surrounding temples and architectural relationships provide substantial evidence for that association. But later Egyptians restored and reinterpreted the monument. One of the most famous pieces of evidence is the dream stele erected by Pharaoh Thutmose for between the Sphinx's paws. The inscription describes the young prince sleeping near the monument and receiving a divine promise connected with the Sphinx. By the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already ancient. That fact alone is extraordinary. Imagine an Egyptian standing there more than 3,000 years ago, looking at a monument that was already roughly 2,000 years old. To that person, the Sphinx wasn't recent history. It was deep antiquity. And perhaps this helps explain why stories about hidden rooms developed around it. The Sphinx already represented a connection to a distant past. But the most controversial question isn't necessarily what lies underneath. It's how old the monument itself really is. Some researchers have argued that weathering patterns on the Sphinx enclosure indicate exposure to substantial rainfall before the desert climate became dominant. The argument became famous through geologist Robert Schoch and writer John Anthony West. Their interpretation suggested that certain erosion features were more consistent with prolonged rainfall than with simple wind and sand erosion. If correct, the implications would be enormous. It could suggest that parts of the Sphinx were exposed during an earlier, wetter phase of North African climate. But this is where caution matters. Other researchers have proposed alternative explanations involving salt weathering, the properties of different limestone layers, moisture, and the monument's complex environmental history. So even here, the evidence does not provide a simple answer. And that is the recurring pattern with the Sphinx. Every time someone believes the mystery has finally been solved, another layer appears. The monument refuses to give up its secrets easily. Now return to the alleged chamber. Suppose tomorrow researchers genuinely confirmed a large artificial chamber beneath the paws. That would be a major archaeological discovery. But what would make it truly extraordinary? Not the existence of a room by itself. Ancient Egyptians built underground spaces. We already know that. What would matter is what the chamber contained. Organic material could potentially help establish chronology. Tool marks could reveal construction techniques. Ceramics could identify cultural phases. Inscriptions could identify the builders or purpose. Human remains could provide clues about ritual use. And sealed architectural features could tell us whether the chamber was deliberately closed in antiquity. That is the evidence archaeologists would actually need. Not blurry radar graphics. Not anonymous photographs. Not dramatic claims about government suppression. The physical evidence. And this is where modern technology has already transformed Egyptian archaeology. In the Great Pyramid, for example, researchers used cosmic ray muon imaging to identify a previously unknown large void. The 2017 Scan Pyramids study reported a void at least around 30 meters long, detected using multiple independent muon detection technologies. That discovery demonstrated something important. Modern physics can genuinely reveal structures hidden inside ancient monuments without destroying them. So the idea of using advanced scanning technology around the Sphinx isn't ridiculous. It is completely reasonable. The mistake is assuming that every anomaly detected by remote sensing is automatically an ancient architectural chamber. The technology can find something. Archaeology still has to determine what that something is. And perhaps that is why the newest claims surrounding the Sphinx deserve a different kind of attention. Not blind belief. Not automatic dismissal. Investigation. Because the 1992 seismic research already demonstrated that the subsurface environment around the Sphinx is not simply an uninterrupted block of uniform rock. Cavities and geological anomalies were recorded around the monument, including between the paws. That is a legitimate scientific fact. What remains unresolved is the interpretation. Are all the cavities natural? Are some modified? Were any intentionally constructed? Could different phases of Egyptian history have interacted with them? Those are questions worth asking. But there is another reason the Sphinx remains so vulnerable to sensational stories. It has an incomplete archaeological narrative. We know a great deal about the monument, but we don't know every detail. And whenever there is a gap in knowledge, people have a tendency to fill it. Sometimes with careful hypotheses, sometimes with mythology, sometimes with clickbait, and sometimes with genuine discoveries. That is why the title of this story, "They Just Opened a Hidden Chamber Beneath the Sphinx," needs to be handled carefully. If by opened, we mean that archaeologists physically entered and documented a newly confirmed chamber, the evidence available does not currently support presenting that as an established fact. If instead we're talking about previously documented geophysical anomalies and claims circulating about hidden spaces beneath the monument, then there is a real archaeological story here. And perhaps the real mystery is even more compelling, because the Sphinx has already proven that its underground environment can contain features that aren't obvious from the surface. Researchers don't need Atlantis to make that interesting. They don't need an alien civilization. They don't need a lost super technology. They only need one properly documented chamber, one sealed doorway, one artifact with secure archaeological context, one inscription that can be independently dated. That would be enough to rewrite a chapter of Egyptian history. And if nothing is found, that would also tell us something. It would help separate natural geological cavities from deliberate construction and eliminate another layer of speculation. Either way, the scientific process wins. The Sphinx has survived thousands of years because it is made of stone. But stone doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks through fractures, weathering patterns, tool marks, layers, pigments, minerals, and empty spaces. The challenge is learning how to interpret those signals without forcing them to tell us the story we already want to hear. So, did someone just open a secret chamber beneath the Sphinx? The responsible answer is not according to the evidence currently available. But are there documented subsurface anomalies around the Sphinx? Yes. Were cavities detected between paws during earlier geophysical investigations? Yes. Does that prove a hidden ancient library? No. Does it prove Atlantis? Absolutely not. Does it mean the Sphinx has no remaining mysteries? Not even close. And that final point may be the most fascinating one of all. Because the real story isn't that archaeologists have discovered everything. It's that after centuries of excavation, surveying, restoration, and scientific investigation, one of humanity's most famous monuments can still force researchers to admit three uncomfortable words. We don't know yet. And beneath the Sphinx, those three words may be more important than any sensational headline. Because if a genuine chamber is ever confirmed, the question won't simply be what was hidden inside it. The question will be, who built it? When did they build it? Why did they seal it? And what does its existence tell us about the people who created the Sphinx in the first place? Until those questions are answered with physical evidence, the stone remains silent. And perhaps that is exactly why the mystery